Hello everybody, welcome to another video. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to develop compassion. But before we get into any specifics, I think it's good that we start with an overview as to why it is there might not be compassion from our perspective in the first place. Here, I've made a table explaining what's actually going on in truth. So at the most basic level, we have our fundamental nature, which I've described in other videos. That fundamental nature would be benign and loving. So you can see that from this self-awareness or from the nature of our true selves, compassion wouldn't be necessary. It already is compassionate in and of itself through its nature. But then arise thought forms, and these thought forms largely reside within the subconscious mind. And they would be things like our subconscious programming, our subconscious conditioning, and our subconscious habits of behavior and thought. From those thought forms generates a self-image. So we have programs and conditioning that then inform what we think we are in terms of a self-image or a sense of self. And that self-image can be thought of as the ego persona. Our self-image or ego persona consists of our body, it consists of our habits of thought, it consists of our conditioning, our programming, it consists of what we like and dislike, our cravings and aversions, things of this nature. Now, in order to maintain or prove itself, prove the ego's own existence, there needs to be narratives or stories that are constantly told to us by the ego so that it is self-enforcing. Now, this process from our fundamental nature all the way down to narratives or stories we tell ourselves is a process of abstraction. Now, abstraction means, in its literal sense, something pulled or drawn away. So through this process of abstraction, you can see that we are drawn away from our fundamental nature, both of ourselves and of life itself, through thought forms. The thought forms arise, and then they generate a self-image, and then that self-image or ego persona perpetuates itself and proves its own existence or maintains itself through narratives and stories, which is again made up of thought forms. Everything outside of our fundamental nature are thought forms arising within awareness itself. Abstraction through thought creates distance, and this is where the lack of compassion comes in. Steve and Bill have a lack of compassion for each other because there's an innate distance created through abstraction. They've abstracted away from their fundamental nature that they both share and now have a hard time being compassionate towards each other. This distance is then maintained through ego defenses, such as projection, which I've made a video on, and things like deflection. But why do we have this distance in the first place? Well, it's important that we ask ourselves, rather than look for an answer outside of ourselves. So instead of hiding away from any deeper emotional energies, we instead investigate them and discover our own underlying reasons as to why there is this distance between each other. Why is there this distance between Steve and Bill? Well, they're going to have to investigate for themselves why that is by actually looking at their emotional energies beneath their conscious awareness. As I've stated in other videos, there is a personal conscious mind and a personal subconscious mind. In the personal subconscious, there are emotional energy reservoirs, and those reservoirs hold raw emotional energy that through thought forms, through images, through feelings, are fed to the conscious mind, the personal conscious mind. So you might have a thought, maybe it's an angry thought. It'll be colored by the raw emotional energy that's beneath your conscious awareness. And this is how you investigate for yourself why it is there's a distance. So if Steve is angry at Bill, he's having angry thoughts. And this anger is being projected out towards Bill. That anger is actually coming from within Steve's subconscious mind and being fed to him in the form of thought forms. The thoughts he's having are colored by the emotional energy of anger. And in this sense, he can sort of work backwards as to where that's coming from. Now that Steve's done some investigation into his underlying reasons, he can shorten the distance through deliberate use of empathy. And this is why we get sayings like walk a mile in their shoes. If Steve were to step back and recognize that his angry thoughts towards Bill are a product of his own anger within his own subconscious, then he could let go of the angry thought forms, witness the anger, And then once he's able to approach the situation from a neutral point of view, he can then engage in deliberate empathy. So he can walk a mile in Bill's shoes by deliberately engaging in imagination and thought that impresses upon himself what it might be like to be Bill or to be in Bill's situation. The other thing that he can do is recognize what makes him similar to Bill rather than what makes him different. He'll recognize through this process that Bill also has reservoirs of emotional energy beneath his conscious awareness, and he's also acting on those things possibly without his self-awareness. He's doing it by habit, he's doing it through programming, he's doing it through conditioning. He can recognize that they both share an ego, they both share thought forms, they both share a misidentification with the ego persona, and they both share a fundamental self. In order to do this effectively, though, Steve is going to have to drop the ego payoffs so that he's not sucked into the temptation to be right or to get one up over Bill or to put him beneath himself so he can be bigger. There's these subtle, vain ego payoffs that we're all invested in because they make us feel good. But that feel good is a very fleeting and temporary sensation that has it doesn't shine a candle against real compassion, real connection, and real love. So I mentioned in the last slide to shorten the distance between you and another person, or for example, Steve and Bill, one of them or both of them would have to engage in deliberate empathy. A good way to approach empathy is through this very useful energy field chart or energy field graph. It's important to recognize that life lived within a given predominant energy field will color life accordingly. And this is very well exemplified in my video on projection. But if you think about it for a moment, you would notice that in the energy field of love, the world looks lovable and loving. If someone's living from the energy field of acceptance, then the world looks acceptable as it is. Everything is perfectly okay. If they're living life from the energy field of anger, then the world looks angry. It's filled with anger and causes anger. If they're living life from the energy field of fear, then the world looks fearful and it's filled with fear and causes fear. So in this sense, everyone is doing the best that they can at any given time or in any given situation. So in order to help engage in deliberate empathy, we have this very simple phrase: everyone is doing the best they can. And this means at any given time or in any given situation. Somebody who's acting from the place of anger only sees anger. They only see angry options. They only see angry thoughts. They only behave in an angry way because that's all they're experiencing at that time. Later, when they're not angry anymore, maybe they move up to acceptance and they can reflect on that time that they were angry, that they behaved angrily, and that this isn't a static state. If someone is acting from a place of love in the world, they don't see the world that the angry person sees. They see a world that's loving and lovable. The angry person sees a place that's angry. They see a place that causes them a lot of anger. There's always something to be angry about. Same with fear. There's always something to be afraid of. But someone who's in the energy field of love doesn't see things that make them fearful, at least not to the degree that somebody who is residing predominantly in the energy of fear would. All right, so now I hope there's enough context that we can get into some practical techniques. One of the most effective ways to increase compassion in our lives is to engage in the loving kindness meditation, otherwise known as metta meditation. What we do is we focus our attention on the heart center or the heart chakra. So Steve would be focusing his attention right here at the center of his chest, and then he would embody the emotional energy of unconditional love. Everybody knows what unconditional love feels like in some sense. Maybe they have a beloved pet or they have a beloved family member. They felt at some point a reason to love somebody or something without any conditions attached. Embody it as best you can. Once you've done that and you have now welled up the energy of unconditional love inside your body, inside your heart, at your heart center, you're going to project it outwards to all beings using the intention. So you have an intention to sit down, to focus your attention on the heart center, to embody the energy of unconditional love, and then you're going to just intend or will the projection of this love outwards to all beings. If you practice this, then the embodiment of unconditional love will increase to such a degree that you feel it emanating from your heart center across the rest of your body and out into the universe. If you practice it even more, you might get to a stage where you can feel this unconditional love all the time, even if it's just to a small degree. And this is how we can use the loving kindness meditation to increase compassion in our lives. There's another technique that's more mental and less of a meditation, more of a contemplation. We're going to engage in flipping the script. And you can see here that instead of shoes, we have Steve wearing Bill's shirt. So in this sense, he's walking a mile in Bill's shirt. How would you feel in their position if the roles were reversed? So you want to start off engaging with this thought experiment by putting yourself in their shoes, or in this case, their shirt, and then how would you feel if you were in that situation exactly? And then, after you've engaged in that, I want you to ask the question, if you were literally them, how would you behave? And necessarily, you would be thinking and behaving in the exact same way because you would be literally them. And this ties into our next slide, where we're deciding to ask the question, what makes us so different? The only thing that makes Bill different from Steve and Steve different from Bill, or you different from anybody else, are programs, conditioning, and habits, which again are all largely unconscious. Some people, they do some work, they begin to become self-aware, and then they can address these unconscious programs, but most people are acting unconsciously. They're acting from an energy field on that scale I showed you, and all they see is a world colored by that energy. So there are more similarities than differences. Not only were Steve and Bill once babies and conditioned by their environment, but they're also fundamentally just simple awareness. The ego persona, the self-image, the thought forms, the conditioning itself are all illusions. They're all thought forms that arise and then we accidentally identify with them. And this is very hypnotizing because from childhood, from babyhood, we were conditioned to do so. And lastly, something that we can ask ourselves is simply what feels better? Everybody has a choice. You can either choose love or you can choose hate. If you step back and notice how you're feeling during a confrontation or, a negative narrative about somebody else, it doesn't feel good. You would rather feel love and kindness and compassion towards that person than hatred, I'm sure. So Steve here and Bill can decide to engage with each other in this way through anger or hatred or fear, or they can decide to be kind to one another, to embody love as best they can. And we know that everyone will feel better when kindness is the default way of being. If everybody approached everybody else through compassion, through kindness, through a willingness to understand, to reach across the other side and really understand the other person's position through empathy, then we wouldn't have as much division in the world. There wouldn't be as much distance. Now, what are the benefits of greater compassion in life? Because it's great to talk about this, but how would this actually impact our lives? Well, in a very practical sense, you won't be as quick to anger. Your fuse, as people like to call it, will be much longer. You'll have a lot more patience in general. You'll have a sense of inner calm available to you at all times because you're approaching life from a place of kindness, compassion, and love. You'll have a growing sense of unconditional love for all life, including your own. This unconditional compassion, this unconditional kindness, this unconditional love doesn't just extend to everybody else, but it also extends to yourself. You'll be more compassionate towards yourself, more patient with yourself, more understanding about your own habits, your own conditioning, your own programming. You'll have an increased ability to empathize and communicate. Because you're engaging in deliberate compassion, deliberate empathy, you'll be able to communicate with others much better. You'll be able to understand where they're coming from and that you both share a fundamental goal to communicate and to achieve a common ground. You both share a fundamental existence as awareness itself. And in this sense, you have an innate compassion for their position as somebody misidentified or mistakenly identified with the ego persona. And a byproduct of this increased empathy and ability to communicate, your conflict resolution and mediation skills are much greater. So you're able to resolve conflict or mediate between two people who might be in a conflict much easier. I want to give an example that came up in one of my other videos. Somebody asked a question about their work situation and their boss. This is from someone named username here 3157. And they asked, regarding being mindful during work, for example, suppose the boss is really toxic and it affects you very much, that it pulls you out of the practice. Reasoning with them isn't of use because they don't view you as a person, but rather a subordinate. How would you tackle this issue? Even if I can let go for the 10th time, I still reach a limit. And I think that this is a very good example of how we can embody a more compassionate frame of mind in order to deal with a situation like this. So this is the answer I gave. First, a greater context is important when interacting with other people as a spiritual practitioner yourself. Remember what we've learned about the ego persona, thought forms, emotional energy reservoirs, projection, attack, and guilt. Keep these things in mind while you read further. We don't know what exactly has happened in your boss's past to have created a habit of superiority or hostility. What we do know is that they are human, have an ego persona that they are mistakenly identified with, and have repressed anger and fear. They are venting those emotional energies through their behaviors, otherwise known as expression. In this sense, it's not personal. They don't see you. They see their triggers and their projections, which is likely pain. If we can let go of our preconceived notions and assumptions about who they are, why they are the way they are, and instead see that they are suffering, we can come from a place of compassion rather than indignation or defensiveness. If you see your boss as just an angry meanie who hates you for no good reason, then you're going to react to that image of them. However, if you recognize that they are fundamentally the same as you are, and are perhaps hurting or suffering or dissatisfied inside, then you can approach the interaction with loving kindness and compassion. You can see here how reframing the relationship and the interactions you have has an incredible impact on how we handle it. I understand that it's easy to feel trapped and defensive when faced with an aggressive person, especially one who has authority over you, but perhaps you can see how many assumptions are being made here. Feeling trapped, defensive, attacked, subordinate to, a victim, small, less than, and subject to the whims of another person's emotional state all point to a mistaken identification with forms, otherwise known as the small self, or ego persona. So now, not only are we letting go of our image of the other person and all that that entails, we're also going to let go of the image we have of ourselves and all that that entails. They aren't the small self, and we aren't the small self. We share a fundamental nature, as I've said in this video. In the moment, it can be tough, but that's why we reflect later and have dedicated time for meditation. This gives us space so that we can discover deeper, more subtle truths about ourselves and others. So in short, let go not only of their behavior in the moment, but also the image you have of them and the image you have of yourself. Meditate on what it is you're taking for granted about them, about yourself, about your life, about your job, about your role, etc. How many assumptions are you making? How much attention are you giving those thought forms? How much of your interactions with this person are habitual? Do you expect them to be mean to you? Your expectations and habit of victimhood actually creates a subconscious energy field where they are compelled, also subconsciously, to fill that role and scenario. I hope that this gives a very good illustration of how we can use compassion in order to interact with other people, particularly other people we have a hard time getting along with. Remember that life lived within a given predominant energy field will color life accordingly. So if you're dealing with an angry person, they're only angry because they're operating from a place of anger. They have a lot of pent-up emotional energy that has to do with raw anger beneath their subconscious awareness. So when they see you, just like in this comment, they don't actually see you, they see their anger. They're projecting out onto the world their thoughts, their feelings, their narrative. And that's why it's important to remember that the ego persona is given validity through the proof it gives you through narratives and stories. If you drop those narratives, if you drop your identification with the self-image, then you recognize all of it is thought forms, and you can get back to your fundamental nature as both benign and loving, as simple beingness itself, as awareness. You're going to undo the abstraction through thought so that this distance that's created between you and another person is shortened, and you can recognize that there's an ego involved both on their side and yours, And through compassion, kindness, deliberate empathy, relinquishing your identification with thought forms, with the self-image, letting go of ego payoffs when it comes to your narratives and stories, you'll recognize that it's much easier to live your life from a place of kindness and compassion, and this develops on its own. Through these practices, you get a taste for what it's like to live from compassion, to live from loving kindness, and then it pays for itself. You enjoy life more because you're more compassionate, so you become more compassionate. So I hope this video helped. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please like, please share, and please subscribe. If you are subscribed, please hit the bell button so that you're actually notified when I release a video. The only reason I bring this up now is because I know that if we engage with the algorithm in the way that it's intended, then this information will reach a much wider audience, and maybe they can also benefit. If you have any thoughts or concerns or questions, or even your own experiences with people and how compassion changed the experience itself or your life in general, please share in the comment section. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.